Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name's Alex Nestor. I'm an investigative fellow at Parents Defending Education. And tonight we're going to break down our most recent report called Cracked Foundations. This is a look into how five massive philanthropies have funded woke ideologies in K 12 schools. And with me to discuss this tonight are my colleagues, Ryan Staley, a researcher at Parents Defending Education, and Scarlen Valderaz, who's a public school advocacy associate at PDE. Ryan, let's dive right into this. How did this all come to be, and why did we start digging into these foundations?
Hey, Alex. So one of the things we started to see that two things. One, consultants were getting a lot of money from these school districts. And so we started to get curious. And then we became even more curious as we hear things like from the teachers union about how schools are significantly underfunded. And so we started to continue to ask more questions about, well, if schools are underfunded, how are they getting this money to pay for these consultants to come in and bring in these programs? And what we found was that these philanthropic foundations have been granting school districts lots and lots of money. So, for example, what we studied was from 2017 to 2020 was five foundations that donated over $200 million in granting to just 10 school districts. So in that period of time, lots of money coming in. And as we continue to pull the threads on that information and dig deeper, we come to find out that they're introducing this equity, social emotional learning programming into schools with this grant money.
$200 million to 10 schools over 5 years. That is quite a lot of money. So I'm curious, what are some of the major findings from this report?
What we found was that, for example, the reading and math scores in these school districts at best have stayed stagnant over that period of time. And what we looked at was including prior to COVID, that those numbers, because obviously COVID had a different effect. So we wanted to make sure that we went back far enough, basically 2017 at least. And we saw, again, that at best, their reading and math scores stayed at least stagnant. And so what it told us is that this money is being poured in for this programming, but we're not seeing the effects that they're promising.
Could you maybe take a deeper dive into a couple of the programs that this money is funding?
Yes. So a couple of key initiatives, for example, the Wallace Foundation, that was promoting a couple different initiatives. And so one of the big picture things that we found was they're funding social emotional learning inside the schools. They're also funding programming for their principals and their administrators on how to bring equity into their school district and make it a system-wide piece to what they're doing. And so, that's that's one piece. And on top of that, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation were funding initiatives that included things like the promotion of grading for equity, which is supposed to rid the school of any kind of bias in grading, which we know is not, we know from the data is not effective.
So are there only five foundations involved in this and only 10 school districts?
Well, one of the things we looked at was we found that over 70 some different school districts were receiving money from these foundations, but we felt that to really get a good capture of what's going on is that we just focused on 10. So believe it or not, there's more money, going out, and there's more foundations. We just focused in on those five for now, but there are a lot of organizations. And one of the other things too that we didn't dig into, and I want people to know, is that these foundations will also give money to secondary foundations who then funnel money in for other similar ideological pieces. So there's a lot going on, more than we actually even captured.
Mhm. So that brings up a few points here. One, you mentioned earlier, I'm sure parents are always happy to see, oh, look, this philanthropy is funding this great program in my kid's school. And then maybe the sort of diving into that maybe stops there. And I'd love to hear your perspective about, the funding, what it sounds like they're funding in schools. And then secondly, I'd love to dive into this third party aspect a little more too. I know from the report that Castle, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, received, I think it was 10 million from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I mean, that's quite a lot of money, and that too is going right back into schools. So I'd love for you to touch on maybe those two elements if you could.
Yeah, so part of let's do Castle first, and they were a partner in the Wallace Foundation Social Emotional Learning Initiative. And so what's interesting is they got $10 million directly from the foundations, but also as part of the programming, they were contracted with the school district. So, for example, in Denver, is that the Wallace Foundation and the Bill Gates Foundation were funneling money in for separate programming. For example, the Wallace Foundation was giving money for what they called their Social Emotional Learning Initiative. And this initiative was focused on how these school districts could implement this social emotional learning programming throughout the district and throughout the schools. The Gates Foundation was funding equity projects and how to bring about anti-racist programming within the school, which included equity grading or grading for equity. And this was to the tune of $10 plus million of this money being spent. And one of the things I want to highlight with the social emotional learning piece with Denver is that it wasn't just social emotional learning. Denver Public Schools was implementing transformative social emotional learning, which is designed for the students to look at how the system is oppressive to their academic performance.
So, Ryan, you included academic performance in the report when you look at the specific districts. And I'm curious if you could discuss a little bit more the correlation between these districts' academic performance and these massive amounts of funding that we're seeing from the philanthropies pouring into these districts.
Sure. So, for going back to Denver for just a minute, one of the things we notice with long-term data on their academic performance, because we do have some of that on them, is that at best it stayed stagnant. So after years of money being poured into that district for this programming, their academic performance at best didn't improve. It stayed the same. But if we jump over to another district, actually one of the most well-funded districts in all of our investigation was Battle Creek. Battle Creek had gotten at least $30 million from the Kellogg Foundation between the years 2017 to 2021. And yet their elementary students are doing math at a 12% proficiency rating and about a 15% proficiency rating in reading. And so we're seeing this money pour in, but we're not seeing the outcomes that are being promised.
So basically, right, you just said it. We're seeing these philanthropies pour in tons and tons of funding, for things like race and gender ideology in schools, and yet these kids aren't performing very well. And that has very long-term consequences, I think, for these kids. Do you agree?
Correct. And what we talk about all the time as an organization and in others in our line of work is we're all these programmings, these equity programming, social emotional learning, which is using up a lot of class time, and yet our students are more and more not being able to read and write and do math. And so the question becomes, is the money that's being poured in for those programs worth what they're promising? And as far as our investigation goes, there doesn't seem to be that connection between that money and that time spent and the outcomes that they say are supposed to happen.
Right. For our advocates watching tonight, can you just list the 5 philanthropies in the 10 districts that we looked at in our report?
Sure. So what we looked at was the Bill and Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which is historically the cereal company, Wallace Foundation, which was the owners of Reader's Digest, the Windward Fund, which is a sub program of Arabella Advisors, and then Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is obviously Mark Zuckerberg and his wife. When we looked at districts, we looked at Battle Creek in Michigan, we looked at Denver in Colorado, Tulare County in California, Palm Beach County in Florida, Dallas Independent School District in Texas, Tulsa Public Schools, Lindsay Unified in California, Jefferson County in Kentucky, Broward County in Florida, and then Columbus in Ohio.
Got it. Ryan, what's really interesting to me here is I'm just kind of trying to think of what could possibly be the connection between these massive organizations and schools in the first place. What even started these types of cooperations?
I can't attribute like motivation per se, at least at the beginning. I think I'm the type of person that I like to attribute that, is probably with goodwill that, hey, there's a problem. We want to solve these problems. I think along the way, there are a lot of people that believe that equity, social emotional learning are the way to solve these issues. And yet they've been quote unquote experimenting with this push of ideology into the schools for over a decade, and we're actually seeing declining scores in all facets. And so, I would say that it initially started with good intent, and then over time, for example, one of the key organizations that's involved in this is CASEL with the social emotional learning, and it's a collaborative academic and social emotional learning organization, and they have been really pushing this systemic change, and the system is oppressive towards minorities, and I think over time it just became it did become a bit ideologically driven, but I think in the beginning there was this honest attempt, especially by people inside the schools, to want to make changes for their students.
Well, in school districts too, I mean, they're always looking for more resources and more things
Mm-hmm.
for kids. Both of my parents are teachers, and, they're always looking for new things to try in their classrooms. And, when someone comes by with money and new things to try, it would sort of make sense for teachers and schools to want to get
Absolutely.
involved, especially because sometimes the language that these philanthropies use to sell these programs it sounds really nice, right?
Right. And if you look at the roots, so one of the things we did with the project is we looked at the roots of what, for example, Bill and Melinda Gates the foundation, the grant, what their roots were, like what was their ideology. And we saw that their ideology was very much diversity, equity, inclusion. In fact, Gates Foundation and the Zuckerberg Initiative both run within their organization what's called affinity groups, which are segregating people by race or gender, etc. And so we looked at the roots of these companies as well as what they were pushing out. And it makes sense that what they're pushing out to the schools is what they believe in. And you're correct. If somebody comes to you with, a couple $1 million grant, it's very hard to say, no, we don't want that in our schools.
Right. And I think one of the districts, if I'm remembering correctly, had an affinity book group for kids that was part of one of these, philanthropies and the grants that they gave to one of the districts.
Correct. In fact, one of the districts even defines diversity as people who are non-white, non-Christian, heterosexuals. So we're seeing those tentacles filter in, the ideological tentacles filter in, and the money has become a bit of a carrot and a stick,
Mm-hmm.
right? So how do we get, one of the things that we found also is that as that money comes in, it's being used to push the agenda of these philanthropy
Sure.
organizations.
Right. Let's bring in our colleague Scarlen here. Scarlen works with parents every single day. You're always talking to parents on the ground across the country. And Scarlen, I'm really curious, when parents read this report, what are their main concerns that they're bringing to you?
Oops, sorry, I was muted. I definitely have heard a lot of buzz from our parents when this foundation's report came out, and they're already worried about these big nonprofits coming in and giving money. But one of the things that may not be so obvious, what our parents are concerned about, is the data collection. So who has access to this data? What kind of data is being collected? Is that data being transferred or shared with anyone else? It's one of the biggest concerns that I've heard, Alex, from our parents.
Ryan, can you maybe walk through an example of this happening from, the philanthropies, the grant money, and now data collection in schools?
So data collection was a big part of especially the Wallace Foundation's programming. So for example, in their social emotional learning initiative, which went out to, I believe, about 16 different school districts, um, part of the contracting was that the Rand Corporation, which does a lot of research, was contracted in this grant programming, and they were to collect data and put together research reports. Well, then the Rand Corporation would go and subcontract with, for example, a company called Excel Labs, who would then come in and collect all this social emotional data via surveys, et cetera, like we see with Panorama Education. And then that would be documented and collected over a 10-year period. So you're talking about multiple, layers of data collection on these kids over a vast period of time on their social emotional learning, behaviors and so forth. So data collection was a big, big part of what we found going on with all of this.
Got it. And I don't think we've brought up Panorama Education yet in our conversation. So maybe for our advocates, could you give them a quick reminder of what Panorama Ed is and what they do?
So Panorama Education is a private company that works in education field, and they have contracts throughout the country with school districts, with state boards of education. We highlight that with Hawaii, where they had a $1.5 million contract for the year. And what they do is they have a software program the school districts enter all their students onto. And they do surveys throughout the year where they collect data, sometimes very personal data, including gender status, suicide, that type of question sets, and then they give reports back. And one of the things with Panorama that's a little bit disturbing right now is they have a behavioral dashboard which actually takes into account all of the students' academic, social, emotional data. It's a complete picture. So, now these outside companies have access to not just survey data, they're getting access to all of a child's data that a school district might collect.
Oh my goodness. Scarlen, back to you again with your work with parents. What do you think parents should be taking away from this? And also, what should parents do?
That's a great question. I really think that when parents find out if any of those organizations are in their schools already, just become curious and ask questions. It shows, again, that it's super important for parents to ask questions. Some questions that you can ask are, what outside grants have you applied for and for what programs? See if any organizations have already donated to your school or maybe plan on donating to your school. And some ways to see if they've already been in your school is to just search the school district website, go to the search bar, and then type in the Bill Gates Foundation or whatever organization you might suspect is already in your schools. You can always reach out to your local administration as well, your superintendent. Look on the foundation website. They are very proud of the money that they give to public schools and school districts, so you can find that information there too. And if all of this doesn't really work out for you, school administration isn't really being cooperative with you, then you can always go and file a FOIA request to see if something concerning could be brought up. Another thing, also speak to your local school board members. They might know if there are any of those organizations in your school already.
And Parents Defending Education has resources on our website for parents. If you need help figuring out how to file a FOIA, we have that at defendinged.org. And you can also reach out to us if you have any questions or need any help with that. So I'll turn it back to Ryan for some final thoughts here. If you could just sort of wrap it up for us, Ryan, what are, again, some of the main points and main takeaways from parents, and what can we do after finding all this information?
Well, I think it's important to understand where this money's coming from and what it's being used for. And to echo Scarlen, ask questions. Just keep asking questions. And again, worst case scenario, you can reach out to us and we'll help you figure it out. We want to support foundations helping kids to learn and to grow and to achieve these things. There's great organizations that are funding reading initiatives, etc. So it's not that we're against this money coming in. I know for me personally, as a former teacher, there's a lot of good stuff going on in schools. The biggest thing is understanding where this money is coming from, and how it's being used and what's being implemented because of that money. I would suggest that if you do find questionable, money coming in, for example, some of these, equity initiatives, one solution is to do some homework and find some alternatives as suggestions. So there's a lot of granting opportunities out there and a lot of organizations that are looking to donate money to districts. Don't just tear down, but offer alternatives that can achieve the same function that for example, we want to improve reading and math scores. So let's find those dollars that are geared specifically towards those things.
That's right. And for parents too, we did 10 districts here. We have 10 districts on our website and reports about all of them. But right, it's so important, as Scarlen and Ryan have mentioned, to look on your district website and figure out, what's going on there. And also look into these foundations too. Scarlen, I'm really glad you brought up that a lot of these foundations have on their own websites, all of the grant funding that they've given out. Like you said, they really like talking about it. So it's really important to maybe do a search on these foundations' websites. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we found a couple of years ago, had been pushing for this anti-racist math curriculum through a bunch of other organizations that they had given grant funding to. And you can find all of this information. It's sort of surprising to me, and Ryan and Scarlen, I'd love to hear your perspectives on this too. It's surprising to me how much of this information is publicly available. Ryan, looking at this report here, a lot of this was 990 filings and other things, right? This is information that people can find on the internet.
Correct. Between the organization's 990s, which are a couple years behind, so you're not going to get the most current. However, at the same time, you can correlate that with their websites, where many of these organizations, as you said, have a grant database that you can search and look for where this money is being spent.
Got it. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us. Before we sign off, I just want to say you can read our Cracked Foundations project at defendinged.org/foundations. And as Scarlen said, do some digging in your own schools too. Go to the website, figure out, are there certain projects that are being funded by these or other organizations at your kid's school? And as always, if you see something interesting, let us know. And we're happy to help when it comes to filing public records requests or hearing out your concerns and trying to figure out how to solve it in your school. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. Thanks, Ryan and Scarlen, for joining me, and have a great night, everyone.